So I think, no, we don't really need much more introduction to Professor Igor Rudin, who's Professor of International Health, and it's always found that last part, molecular
medicine,
unusual, because you draw together these two different, what seems like separate issues, but in fact are in many ways are coming together hugely in the new global health agenda.
Really?
This is a pre-slide rather than the actual beginning of your talk.
All right.
Okay, so Igor, over to you, and then afterwards we'll have some questions from the group.
If you will talk.
Yes, I hope.
Oh, there we are.
That's it. All right.
On the CHNRI Method.
Wonderful. So the only problem here is not to fall. All right.
Okay.
Is it safer to be here or here?
Well, just...
What is here? Okay. Everything fine? Okay, so good morning everybody, and fantastic to be here today and to talk about the CHNRI Method, which is a tool to manage research ideas and set funding priorities using collective knowledge. My name is Igor Rudin. I'm a professor of International Health and Molecular Medicine. I am also research director of the Center for Population Health Sciences, and I'm co-chairing the WHO Collaborative Center for Population Health Research and Training at our center. Also, I'm one of editors-in-chief of the Journal of Global Health. So obviously, I have quite a lot of interest in global health. Now, let's talk about global health research today. So firstly, busy slide, and actually this is a very maybe moderate and simplified representation of the global health research system. So what do we have in global health research system? This is actually showing how people generate knowledge in global health. You start with donors, and they can be from public or private sector. Then there are people who are recipients. There are research teams generating new knowledge. They range from public to private organizations. Then there are stakeholders governing dissemination of this knowledge. They could be researchers and teams themselves, but also journal editors, company owners, and so on. Then the knowledge gets disseminated, and it can get disseminated in these days not only anymore for journals and books, but it could get just posted on the internet, or be confidential report, or published in an open access or not open access journal, and so on. Eventually it becomes either freely available to all users, or it has restricted access. From there it gets translated, there are spin-out companies, there are people trying to replicate findings, secondary meta-analysis, and so on, and eventually all this feedback goes back to those who fund the research, and then they decide what to do in the next cycle. So this is a very dynamic system in which many people are generating many activities all the time. A lot of money is being spent, a lot of knowledge is being generated. This system obviously is dynamic, and it has a life of its own, and it's constantly trying to be better and more efficient. And there are some needs of this system, and we can see them on this right-hand side. So at the level of donors, there is a need to somehow coordinate the funding among donors, so they're not overfunding the same things while leaving others underfunded. Then there is a level of recipients, and at the level of researchers, there is a need to prioritize between many ideas and then come with the best ones to receive the funding. At the level of stakeholders governing dissemination, there is a need to recognize what's a successful research from those that is not really successful. Then at the level of dissemination, there is a need to ensure broad and rapid accessibility for open access. So anything that is not doing it is actually retarding the whole system, and we know that there are such things. And finally, there is a need at the end of it all to evaluate what were the returns on investments in this research in the first place, and how should we define them, and so on. So all these things are needs that could make the global health research system better, and all of those needs are constantly being addressed in different ways. And I'm going to focus today on just one of those needs where I think we've made quite a big progress over the years, and that is a need to prioritize among many research ideas. So setting priorities on what research should be done in the first place. We are working at the moment also on some other needs, like to coordinate funding or to evaluate returns. We have plans to address those needs too, but I'm going to talk only about this need today so that you understand in the big picture what are we addressing today, right? Okay, so who of all people would have interest to get some work done on the research priorities and to fund this research? Well, it was the World Bank. The World Bank actually funded Global Forum for Health Research. Global Forum for Health Research was almost like a wing of the World Health Organization, somewhat dislocated to take care of governing research. And the World Bank gave some money to Child Health and Nutrition Research Initiative to develop research, some tool that could set research priorities in a fair way. Because there were many attempts over the years to do this, but none of those attempts was terribly successful or really picked up. And through a sequence of bizarre events, I found myself as being a consultant who led this whole effort, and I was given all this money. And I formed a team of people from very, very different backgrounds because I wanted everybody's input, from people who have backgrounds in research, but also policy, also law, ethics, funding, economics, anything you can think of. So we had a fantastic team of enthusiastic people from various backgrounds, and we started meeting all over the world. And in 2005, we met in all these places, and then we kept meeting in all these lovely places too, and then in 2007 we kept meeting at these places, and eventually we ran out of money. But we still did some work while meeting. Every time we were making a little bit of progress. So it took us 12 big meetings of this group for several days each time to work through the concepts and develop something that could pick up and work eventually. So we were tackling like big fundamental issues, like how do you define health research and what are the boundaries of health research? So that would be a question. Now, where do we start from if we were setting research priorities, health research priorities? What is health research in the first place? How do you define health research? So basically, the questions were being asked: is the research into safer roads, is that health research? Because clearly that kind of research can reduce burden of disease in the population. Or is research into genetics of yeast, is that health research? Because is it just is it helping humanity in any way to understand it? Is research in genetically modified crops, would that be considered health research? Because certainly those crops may grow somewhere where you wouldn't expect them and feed the population in the times of droughts or famine. And finally, research into safer cars, is that health research? Because surely it can prevent accidents and so on. So what is health research? Where are the boundaries of what should we call a health research? Well, eventually we agreed that the health research is something that is a process that starts with research question. If answered, this research question generates new knowledge. Then this new knowledge needs to get translated and implemented, and eventually it ends in disease burden reduction. If this process is followed from start to the end, or at least there is a vision for this process to go from research question all the way to burden of disease reduction, that's what eventually makes it health research, all right? And the trouble is that we realize that all too often health research is stuck in this vicious cycle, which is that once new knowledge is generated, then based on its novelty, its attractiveness, opportunity to publish in high-impact journals, media coverage and lobbying, just more money is being given to continue the research down that route without ever really fully exploring the potential of translation of that knowledge and achieving burden of disease reduction. So then, after being happy that that's the definition of health research, we started struggling with some major challenges, like how are we going to convince somebody that we were systematic, that we took into account all the possible ideas for health research? So the number of potential research ideas is infinite. And how do you manage infinity? Physicists can't do it, mathematicians can't deal with it. So how do you manage infinity? How do you convince somebody that the process has been fair and transparent and systematic if you didn't take into account every single idea and give it equal chance to be judged against all the other ideas? Well, that was a big problem, and one of the 3 major problems. There were 17 minor problems, but 3 really major, and this was the one that didn't look in the beginning that we were going to be able to solve it. So we went into circles for a few meetings, but eventually we came up with some ideas. So we realized that we can split this big infinity into 4 smaller infinities. I mean, they're still infinite there. But those 4 infinities would kind of fit into the big infinity, and they would be separate of each other, clearly separate. So one is epidemiological research questions. Now, what are epidemiological research questions? If you have a population, and if you know that if you just took from everybody here all their complaints about their health and put them into one massive barrel, you know, that would be their burden of disease of this population here, right? So, if now you knew that also some of these people actually started smoking, and some started drinking, and some started being exposed to some solid fuel fumes or something like that, because of those things, and you can see here that actually some are exposed to 2 risks at the same time, some even to 3 risks at the same time, because of this, the burden of disease would get even bigger than it could have been without those risk exposures. But then the situation is never as grim as this, because there is always some interventions that government or people themselves apply. For example, there could be a vaccination program, and there could be a program you know, to prevent people from alcoholism, and because of this the burden is slightly reduced. So the research that is allowing us to understand the size of the burden of the problem and the determinants of the burden of the problem, that's epidemiological research. So that research just describes how big is the problem and what is the architecture of that problem. Okay? So that's epidemiological research. Now, let's move on to completely different type of research or instrument of research, and that is health systems and policy research. Now, that one follows kind of the epidemiological research. You get to understanding of the burden and its determinants, and then you're asking yourself, okay, with the resources that we have, with the money that we have, and understanding that we have, could we do some research to do better and reduce more of the burden with things that we already have? For example, we could realize that, you know, we could increase the outreach by better planning or applying this in the other different part of the season. Maybe more people would be willing to accept vaccination. Or maybe that we were giving this intervention to people who are unlikely to take alcohol, but actually we should start delivering it for the same cost to the people who really would benefit more from this intervention. And thanks to that research, thanks to that new knowledge of how to become more rational with what you already have, you can actually reduce burden of disease a bit further. Now that's the second little universe. Now what is the third little universe? The third little universe of ideas is the research to improve the existing interventions. So you already have some interventions like this vaccination and this program, and then you can figure out how to make this vaccine more effective. For example, it protected 60% of vaccinated, but you can add new serotypes to it, and now it protects 90% of all vaccinated. So that's improvement of something that already exists. Or you can make this more acceptable to population or accessible in some way, this intervention, and then more people would turn up. So that's improving the interventions that you already have. And that's boring for most researchers to do. Although for industry, it's never boring. When you get the new mobile phone, the first mobile phones were like this big and awful and awkward and ugly. But then the industry quickly realized that, you know, if they make them more accessible, better, cheaper, and so on, that more of them they would sell, and more people they would reach. So they know the trick, and they put a lot of interest into this kind of improving the existing stuff research, whereas to researchers it seems to be boring to, you know, try to improve something that's already discovered. It's much more fun to discover something completely new. And this is where we have, you know, this research can actually reduce the burden of disease. And then finally, the fourth little universe, but where most of the research actually are active, is research to develop completely new stuff, completely new interventions. So never mind trying to figure out the burden and the size of the problem and the architecture. Never mind trying to understand how to be more effective with what we have. Never mind trying to improve what's already known. This is all about finding something new and new and new and new, and all the time something novel, right? And then when you do find something novel, usually it's expensive and it's only deliverable to people who can afford it, and those people are usually already well covered with interventions. And also, it's, you know, it takes a lot of time to actually become deliverable to everybody. So even if this research ever leads to something, and that's very uncertain if it will or not, it's usually very limited in the potential to reduce disease burden for a very long time. Anyway, so this is the 4 separate universes of research that can be attempted. And we were quite proud of ourselves for figuring this out, and I'll show you why in a minute. So we call the epidemiological research description, we call the health system and policy research delivery, research to improve the existing intervention development, and research to develop new interventions discovery. So 4 Ds, very neat, you know, 4 Ds, 4 separate universes of research, and all together they're forming the entire research universe. So that was good, because now we could do this. We could start from those research instruments, and we could start thinking, okay, within that research instrument, what are the avenues, like broad avenues that you could potentially do within this research? For example, for description, you can measure the burden, you can understand risk factors, or evaluate the existing interventions. For delivery, you can study capacity to reduce exposure to proven health risk, or to deliver efficacious interventions, and so on. So there's some broad avenues. And then you keep branching those avenues into research options within each avenue. And these research options are kind of a level of research projects, 5-year research projects, something that's well known to most researchers. They can relate to it. And then those projects branch into millions of potential research questions, which have zillions of potential sub-questions, and then they branch back into infinity. So you remember, there was that infinity, and it's still now here on the right-hand side, infinity of research questions. But what we managed to do is actually branch it back into something bigger. So now we can actually just stop here and say, okay, look, we can't evaluate zillions of research ideas, but what we could do is stop at this level of research options, you know, do systematically research instrument by instrument, avenue by avenue, anything that's kind of feasible to do over 5 years. And then we would have a very large but inclusive and representative and manageable number of projects, 5-year projects to evaluate. So, you know, we can stop at maybe 200 and at least have the very reasonable coverage of all ideas. So, you know, I spent quite a bit of time explaining all this because it's such a fundamental problem. Everybody who tried to do any prioritization of research ideas before ran into this problem and didn't manage to solve it. Then the second major challenge was the trouble that the outcomes of research are inherently unpredictable. So how should funders manage this uncertainty? Because you can't know whether trying to answer some research question is actually lead to anything useful or not. You can't predict this ahead. So that is another problem. It's similar to, it's maybe even more problematic than dealing with infinity, because this is dealing with predicting the future. So you could see how, you know, we had a problem of dealing with infinity first to be democratic and transparent. Now we have a problem of predicting the future. So how should we do that? Well, maybe we should ask ourselves, we realized that we should, what is a return on investment in health research? And if you have people living in the world, they have their burden of disease, and at the same time they generate every year some wealth, some economic output. And now you could ask yourself a question: why would we want to spend any of that economic output to reduce the burden of disease through health research? Because we can reduce it through all sorts of ways. We could build highways, draw clean water to Africa, and so on and so on. So there are many ways of improving the problems of health. Why do it through health research? So again, asking ourselves, who are the stakeholders here? Well, the governments and the international agencies, they will have a genuine drive to reduce burden of disease. And this is why they invest in health research. But the industry, for example, they fund a lot of research and development, but not for reducing the burden of disease. Industry is industry. They are not expected to reduce the burden of disease. They're expected to generate profits and to employ people and generate more profits. So their private sector, and we can't hold them accountable for reducing burden of disease, because this is not what they're supposed to do. If they invest in health research, it's for the money, it's for generating products that they can sell. They don't care, they don't need to care whether those products eventually reduce burden of disease or not. They just need to care whether they made money that year. And then you have this new class of non-profit players which have their own priorities. And if you are Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and have billions of dollars to invest in health research, you can do whatever you really want. If you want to eradicate polio or malaria, you can go for it. So we realized that based on that, we can actually start addressing the uncertainties around the future outcome of these research activities by defining the context for prioritization. If you're completely transparent about this context before we start any exercise, then it's going to become apparent what is going to be more or less risky. So firstly, we need to define, working with donors, what is their motivation? Is it to reduce burden of disease, or is it to generate patents, or is it to get a Nobel Prize? What is the drive behind their investment in health research? Also, what kind of style of investment they want to take, because even when you know what you want to achieve, you can achieve it in different ways. For example, you can be like very sensible about your investments and very well balanced, like governments should probably be with taxpayers' money, but you can be risk averse, like pharmaceutical industry, because you don't want to spend too much money on something that's unlikely to work. Or you can be risk seeking, like the foundations, private charities, they can afford to be risk seeking and just set themselves goals and go for it no matter what it costs. Then what kind of population is your target? Is it global, regional level, national, subnational? Is it specific group of population like children? What are you focused on? Some disease or some product or some slice of a burden particularly? And then most importantly, what is your time frame? When do you want to see some effects or results of the investments in your research? Do you want to see them as soon as possible, or do you want to see them in some midterm, or do you not care unless it's, can you afford to think downstream like 20, 30 years? Because something could immediately help, but then have a very limited capacity to remove the problem, and something could just wipe out the problem like a vaccine, but it may take 20 years. So how do you balance between something that takes 20, 30 years of research to eventually get a product and something that can immediately start saving lives in Africa for children who are dying at the moment, right? So it's very, very difficult to know what everybody wants. And those people themselves didn't really understand how complicated this is, but they really responded well to this kind of framework, because they could immediately recognize what's their motivation, style, population target, and time frame. They could immediately agree on what they want. And once they agreed on what they want, it was far easier for us to start judging the risk of the outcome. So we set up some criteria that are going to judge the risk of the outcome. So we want the successful research, the research to be prioritized, to actually go through this framework, to start with a question, generate new knowledge, get translated, and reduce burden. So there is a risk. We don't want to fall into this trap of novelty and then never getting down to implement the knowledge. Unfortunately, too often, the translation research and implementation research was considered boring for donors, and unless industry was involved, it was difficult to get anything funded. And this couldn't be more ridiculous, because by continuing to fund fundamental research, where vast majority of funding was going, we're basically just expanding the boundary towards the unknown and constantly expanding that boundary without ever achieving the potential of this knowledge to translate it and then reduce burden in the population. And guess who the main funders of all that fundamental research was? It was actually MRC and NIH, the governmental agencies with the taxpayers' money gambling on something very, very uncertain all these years. And they should have been the ones who should have balanced far better, fundamental research with translation and implementation. And now, only in the last 5, 6 years, since all this understanding has been finally realized, have both NIH and MRC starting really focusing on translation research. And in NIH, they're now building the whole facility for, part of the Institute for translation only, and in the recent research assessment exercise here in the UK, now they're asking for these impact statements. They want to see what impact the research have. It's not just anymore what impact factor and how, you know, exciting and blah blah. You know, now it's all about, not all, but it's really increasingly about impact, and this is set to continue. And I can't, you know, be more happy to see that, actually. So now let's think, when you're doing health research, what risks are you taking here if you want to predict what's going to happen? So we say that to get from research question to generating new knowledge, the research needs to be likely to be answerable in an ethical way. Then to get from new knowledge to translation and implementation, it has to have a potential to be effective against the problem. To get from translation and implementation to burden of disease reduction, it has to also be deliverable and affordable to the population. Finally, even once you reduce the burden of disease, some research can have a huge potential to reduce burden of disease, and some research very limited potential. And even then, you know, if two kinds of research have similar potential to reduce burden of disease, even then one may do it in a more equitable way and one may do it in a more inequitable way. So one may be reducing the burden in the rich and one kind of evenly across the population, or even only among the poor, so that it improves equity. So we realize that these are kind of 5 standard criteria that are judging the risk of investing in health research and kind of telling you how likely is it really to work all the way to implementation versus not. So to warn you from the start that some of these steps may just not be feasible and you shouldn't prioritize the research, which is not really usually how funders thought. There are many, many more research criteria that we could use to judge in different settings and different circumstances. So, and decisions on different priorities based on different criteria will always conflict each other. So that was the second challenge, and I think we managed to address it by defining the context, being transparent about the context of prioritization, and then using a set of criteria. But then the last challenge was how to use the list of ideas and the context and the criteria to rank all feasible ideas in some fair and transparent and replicable way. Because the research ideas eventually come from researchers themselves. And if you know anything about the researchers, if you know first thing about them, that is that they tend to think that their idea is far better than somebody else's. And they're never going to easily acknowledge that somebody else's idea is necessarily better. So how do you get all those researchers to actually agree among 200 of them proposing 700 ideas, which one is the best? Well, you know, and without them favoring their own idea. Well, this is where the collective knowledge and crowdsourcing approach kicks in. So this is how we do it. We firstly talk to the funders, define the context, define the criteria, and pass this knowledge on to the researchers. So funders define context, criteria, and select management group for the CHNRI exercise, and then they just have to remove themselves just there. And then the management team that conducts the CHNRI exercise becomes important. What do? They choose a large group of technical experts. They could take, for example, 200 most productive researchers in the past 5 years, and then somebody can accuse us of being elitist by doing that. But in practice, you know, those are the people who are going to get most of the research funding in the next 5 years, because the funders are going to look at the track record, and these are going to be the people with the track record. So it's important to ask those people what do they think should be research priorities, right? So management team, you know, contacts those 200 excellent top researchers, and when they get a letter from, say, WHO, we identified you like among top 100 researchers in our area, then they like it usually, and they are keen to respond, we noticed. So, so those people then submit many ideas for research, and then eventually consolidated, this list of ideas is kind of consolidated, there are duplicates removed, and the management team gives them the list back. And then they have to score all research ideas completely independently of each other, not even knowing each other, not knowing who gave which idea. They just have to score them against 5 criteria and priority setting. Just say, is this likely to be answerable, yes or no? Is this likely to be deliverable, yes or no? And then you are capturing their collective optimism towards different components of different research ideas. And finally, you can even involve the larger groups of stakeholders, the people who are not researchers and don't necessarily understand research, but they still understand the criteria. So for example, you can ask the people coming to a conference or even the general public, what of those criteria would you give more weight? For example, when we were in South Africa, people were very sensitive about equity. And if something wasn't at least 80% likely to be equitable, then they said this shouldn't be considered a priority. And similarly, in America, people were all about maximum potential for disease burden reduction. If something has a large potential, then it should be, supported, and then we should figure out how to make it more answerable, more equitable, and so on. But for them, it's all, bang for the buck, and so on. So in different cultures, different things are going to be more or less important, and it's good to know these things and ask about it. So these people are not going to give you research ideas because they don't understand research well enough, but they could tell you what they value more as a criterion for prioritization of those ideas. So eventually you collected all this input from all these people, and then you just calculate the rankings for each research idea and present the list back to the funders. So what the output of this looks like, you usually have a list of 200 ideas here that were proposed or so, and then you have each one belonging to one of these universities, one of these types of health research, and then this is just basically their collective opinion. 87% of people said that this would likely be answerable, 89% effective, deliverable, and so on. Is this likely to be right? Who knows? I mean, nobody knows, but these are 200 most knowledgeable people in the world in this area, and if they 87% believe that it's answerable, then it's probably very likely to be answerable. I mean, they can't all be wrong, and basically this now serves to a funder as a warning or informative, thing. And it's similar to stock market, really, because when you're going to invest in stock market, you want to also have a list of all companies, and you have some parameters for each company. You want to know what is, some price over earnings or this or that, and then you base your decision in what to invest based on those parameters. Similarly here, you have things that you need to watch for in order to make the health research effective and successful, and this is telling you what is more or less likely. And then based on this information, you can still decide to do whatever you want. So, a large number of health research options received their intermediate and overall priority scores. They're all ranging from 0 to 100, and therefore are transparent and intuitive, and the scoring is democratic. So, what is then the CHNRI methodology for setting priorities? It's a process that prioritizes a large number of competing ideas using defined context, criteria, and collective wisdom. So, investors starts it with defining the context, criteria, and expectations. Technical experts then list research options and apply criteria and score research options. And other stakeholders may place weights and thresholds and adjust final scores, and they go back to the investors. So, this is the CHNRI process. There are 4 papers that have then, after all our work, described all about this methodology. Firstly, we reviewed the principles and practice before of the previous attempts to do this, then defined all these challenges and framework, finally, provided guidelines for implementation. And after that, people started, doing it and picking it up, and more papers started coming up based on the CHNRI process, now counting about 30 of them, and in quite decent journals. You can see Lancet, PLOS Medicine frequently publish this, and so on. So, and many uses, and what's really rewarding is that in 8 cases so far, people have done this without even feeling a need to contact me or anyone who's been developing this methodology. They actually could figure it all out from the papers, and they've done it themselves in the places where you'd never think, like burden of zoonotic diseases in India, or impaired mental health in Brazil, and so on and so on. So it's always fantastic to see that you develop something and put it in the public domain, and people actually start using it. That's great. So what is now a reflection of what was happening before this process and what is CHNRI changed? So before this process, typical consensus development process was a Delphi method where you're being provided some background reading and then the group is invited by somebody for discussions and there is an expert interaction. And it's been proven over and over again that during this expert interaction, this is nothing but imposing opinion of some more powerful people on those who are less loud or less likely to be willing to, counter them. And eventually, opinion of a very few people becomes opinion of a group, and then this group goes out of the room and it becomes opinion of the many people out there without really ever being properly assessed or discussed. And in CHNRI, there is no background reading. We just want everybody's knowledge to be used the way it is. We don't want to influence anyone. There's no discussions, no interactions. They're just collective, It's kind of everybody's and nobody's opinion at the same time. It's a collective opinion. And then you could even do agreement statistics after the exercise is conducted to see what were the research ideas that had the most controversy or disagreement about them and what were the ones who had most agreement. And it gives you, for all sorts of ideas, very specific feedback. So the logic of all this has been described wonderfully in this great book, The Wisdom of Crowds by James Surowiecki. And it showed that in many, many examples that a diverse collection of independently deciding individuals is likely to make types of decisions like this ones far better than any individual expert in vast majority of cases. So this is why it's probably becoming popular, because you feel much better after conducting this kind of exercise. After Delphi, you just feel like, did we really discuss this idea or that idea in great detail, or they were just kind of happy to go home and vote yes? In this process, you feel that it's been a democratic process, transparent process. Everything is completely transparently published after that, who said what. So one retarding force I had against myself once I started talking about this methodology was that everybody was scared that now I'm going to come with those 20 people and we're going to just completely take over the donor's opinion, we're going to influence the priorities all of a sudden, and that everybody who was already getting a lot of funding got very scared of us. But slowly they realized that CHNRI is not telling donors what to do. It just offers information that protects them from some risky investments. And it's easy to conduct, costs nothing, easy to score. We had many, many hundred people participating in more than 30 exercises, easily published eventually and easily interpreted. And it's nothing new, actually. I keep telling to people, this is not something new that you have to fear. I mean, for goodness sake, you've all used these kinds of things when you were sending your kids to college. So when you're sending your kids to college, you want to know something about the university you're sending them to. Like, this is exactly like CHNRI. Look at it. It's Times Higher Education's QS World University Rankings. They use 6 different criteria about the university, and they give scores from 0 to 100. And this is exactly like the result of the CHNRI process. Few hundred ideas with their scores and eventually overall score, and you use it to decide where you want to send your kid to university. So it's just the same principle. We're also we've developed actually the software to conduct CHNRI online, because people kind of, it's a bit boring to score all these questions repeatedly. So people like to do it at the airports when they're stuck in traffic or somewhere on the laptop. So it's working a lot easier now. And there are many possible applications for this. In global health, now that we kind of established this as a practice, we can modify it to start prioritizing investments in healthcare, emerging health technologies, development assistance for health, even global health governance. And then also beyond global health, this is a simple and cheap tool that allows assembling and analyzing collective knowledge and opinion of many people. And it's of possible use to other donor agencies, international organizations, for-profit companies in setting their own strategic priorities among many different ideas based on collective knowledge of their most qualified employees. So there is a scope of using this process everywhere, really, And that's pretty much it. And here is where I end my talk. And there is something I have to say, but not me, probably you, right? So thanks very much. And please keep asking questions after this. Yeah.